revenue pressures on the nation's budget are. We must plan for these strengthening pressures, and that is a key part of preparing our budget for this year. The persistent high dollar, as well as squeezing exporting jobs, also squeezes the profits of exporting firms. With lower profits for these companies comes lower company tax going to government. We can't assume that this will change soon. The high dollar is also placing competitive pressures on firms here who face new pressures from cheaper imports, holding down prices across the board, with the high dollar making it hard for these firms to pass on price increases, holding down profits and in turn holding down company tax. Consumers do benefit, but many businesses are doing it tough. All this means the data on our economy now reveals a significant new fact. This is the striking and continuing divergence between what economists refer to as real GDP growth and nominal GDP growth. My best shorthand description of those terms is this. Real GDP growth is growth in the volume of the economy, the actual activity in the economy, how many jobs there are, the quantity of infrastructure we build, the amount of jobs and services we export, how many tonnes of coal, how many international students pay for a course here, how many houses are built. Nominal GDP growth counts this growth in volume, and it also counts growth of the prices of all these things. Today, Today, real GDP growth is growing solidly. We're creating more jobs, exporting more goods and services, and buying and selling more from each other, just as we planned. However, prices are growing at a slower rate than is usual for this stage of the economic cycle, a slower rate than was forecast. And so nominal GDP growth for this current year is significantly slower than was forecast. And we expect nominal GDP growth for future years to be revised down. The current data shows nominal GDP growth after the first half of the 2012-13 year was at an annual rate of 2%. At budget last year, we had forecast nominal GDP to grow at 5%. What's changed? While the prices of our exports continue to be lower than their recent peaks because of weak global demand and increasing global supply, the prices of imports are now lower than forecast because of the strength of our dollar. The prices of goods produced at home are also lower than forecast because competition from imports is so fierce. This is now putting so much downward pressure on prices that growth in nominal GDP is actually lower than growth in real GDP. What's more, this has now been true for nearly an entire financial year, since the beginning of the June quarter last year. This has never happened for such a long period in the whole half a century and more of the national accounts. Not during the global financial crisis, not during the 1991 or 1982 recessions, not even during the Menzies credit squeeze of 1961, which was effectively a deliberate policy attempt to slow price growth, do we find a similar effect. Now, that's a long explanation of a pretty technical fact. But for the budget bottom line, it's a very meaningful fact, because naturally enough, companies don't pay tax on volume, they pay tax on value, which is driven by price. The Pharaoh might have kept 1/5 part of the grain from the field, but the tax commissioner collects in dollars and cents. So even if the economy is growing as much as expected, when prices are growing much less than expected, tax grows much less too. The bottom line for the budget bottom line is this. The amount of tax revenue the government has collected so far this financial year is already $7.5 billion less than was forecast last October. Treasury now estimates that this reduction will increase to around $12 billion by the end of the financial year. This unusually low revenue, which wasn't forecast even a few months ago, creates a significant fiscal gap over the budget period. Put simply, spending is controlled, but the amount of tax money coming to the government is growing much slower than expected. Inevitably, confronted with these facts, the economic simpletons and sloganeers will squirm and throw in arguments to distract. First, you will be told that revenue for the next financial year is still expected to be more than this financial year. That's true. At the same time, our population will be larger, more people will be on the age pension, healthcare costs will continue to rise. Indeed, the growth in health and in the age pension will be far higher than the growth in tax money. So revenue growth will be less than natural growth in key areas of expenditure and is spectacularly lower than reasonably predicted. It is the failure of growth in tax money to match reasonable predictions that creates the budget challenge. Second, you will be told it isn't about less tax money, it's about spending. However, as informed commentators like Tim Colbatch pointed out last week, excluding East Asia, total government spending in Australia is already the second lowest in the developed world. Of the advanced Western economies, only Switzerland spends a smaller share of its economy on government than does Australia. The total size of government here is less than the US, less than the UK. Not as measured in revenue either, measured in spending. And let me reiterate, for the future we will continue to match new spending in the budget with savings. Given all this, tax money down, spending controlled, the question for budget planners that is difficult to answer but simple to state is as follows. How and how fast to fill that significant fiscal gap? Some of the above factors will return to trend. Overall, revenue is being revised downward over the coming 4 years, not permanently. However, in part, this is a return to normality, returning to long-term averages. Australia will not go back to the extraordinary revenue peaks of mining boom Mark I from 2002-3 to 2007-8. While we should expect revenue to improve as we move to the production and export phase of the current mining boom, it's clear that the extraordinary revenue peaks of the mid-2000s won't be repeated. The overall story. By 2005-6, the share of the economy taken in tax reached a peak of 24.2% compared to 22.4% in 1996 and 22.2% as we reported in our last update in October. The huge profits of that time meant that company tax revenue reached an astonishing 5.3% of GDP in 2006-7, compared to a share of 4.5% of GDP last financial year, a fall of around $10 billion in company tax a year. Capital gains tax was 1.5% of GDP in 2006-7. Last financial year, it was 0.4%. We collect less than 1/3 of the amount compared to 7 years ago, and in dollar terms, the drop in tax collection is around $15 billion a year. Quite apart from any other factor, remaining competitive in the contemporary global economy doesn't allow us simply to turn back time on tax collections by dialing up tax revenue to these levels. If I can summarise a complex picture in a few brushstrokes, it's these. The prices for what Australian companies sell overseas are lower. Imports are cheaper. Local competition is fierce. Those things add up to business making less profit than planned. That puts pressures on our stable and resilient economy, and it is one reason businesses and workers still need to work